how to turn your pain into your greatest strength. Most people think pain is something to escape, something to hide, something that makes them weaker. Some of the strongest people you know are only strong because they had no choice but to survive. But what if the pain you're trying to forget is the reason you haven't become who you're meant to be yet? I used to believe being strong meant pretending nothing hurt me, until I realized every unhealed wound was quietly controlling my choices, what I feared, what I avoided, and how small I played my life. This isn't about motivation. This is about understanding pain and turning the very thing that tried to break you into the strongest part of who you are. Most people think pain makes them weak. I believe that too. I believe that admitting how deeply something hurt meant I failed. That if pain stayed with me longer than it should have, it meant I lacked resilience. Strength, I thought, was about speed, how fast I could recover, how quickly I could smile again, how convincingly I could act untouched. I learned early how to perform that version of strength, moving on quickly, laughing at the right moments, saying "I'm fine" without hesitation. And for a long time, I confused that performance with healing. But there is a quiet truth that took years to reveal itself. The pain I was running from was not weakening me, it was shaping me. And not always in ways I could see. There was a period in my life when everything looked fine from the outside. No visible collapse, no dramatic breakdown. Life appeared functional. I showed up, I met expectations, I did what was required of me. If someone asked how I was doing, the answer came automatically: I'm good. And strangely, I believed it. At least, I believed it enough to stop asking myself harder questions. But beneath that word "good" there was something unresolved, something heavy, something unfinished. A quiet weight that followed me into rooms, into conversations, into moments that should have felt lighter than they did. I didn't know how to name it at first. I only knew how to avoid it. It wasn't a single catastrophic event, no sharp before and after moment, no clear line where everything broke. It was subtler, and that subtlety made it more dangerous. It was disappointment that never found language. It was rejection explained away as coincidence. It was being overlooked and telling myself it didn't matter. It was feeling replaceable and pretending I didn't care. I labeled my reactions as weakness, sensitivity, overthinking. I convinced myself the problem wasn't what happened, it was how I responded to it. So I did what most people do when pain doesn't feel legitimate enough to grieve. I buried it. I stayed busy. I filled my time with movement. Productivity became a shield. Achievement became proof. Distraction became a lifestyle. I scrolled endlessly. I laughed on cue. I stayed engaged just enough to avoid stillness, and for a while that strategy worked. Busy days left no room for reflection. Noise drowned out discomfort. Forward motion created the illusion of progress. But pain is not something that dissolves when ignored. It doesn't expire. It doesn't get bored and leave. It doesn't soften with time alone. Pain waits. It waits quietly, without urgency, without drama. It waits in reactions that feel bigger than the moment deserves. It waits in the constant replaying of conversations long after they've ended. It waits in sudden anger that surprises even me. It waits in emotional distance disguised as independence. It waits in the subtle fear of trying too hard, because failure would feel personal again. Pain doesn't demand attention immediately. It leaks. Unprocessed pain rarely announces itself loudly. It seeps into behavior. It shapes perception. It influences decisions without ever introducing itself. It leaked into how I saw myself, into what I believed I was worthy of, into the risks I hesitated to take. And one day, without any dramatic event to mark it, a realization surfaced with unsettling clarity. I wasn't living. I was surviving. That realization arrived during a moment that looked ordinary from the outside. Late at night, alone, sitting with a phone in my hand, scrolling through other people's lives, progress, growth, movement, direction. Everything seemed to be happening somewhere else, and there was a quiet heaviness in my chest. Not envy, not jealousy, but exhaustion. A tiredness that didn't come from effort, but from carrying something unnamed for too long. I wasn't stuck because I lacked ability. I was stuck because something inside me was tired of being ignored. That was the moment most people avoid, the moment when distractions run out. Silence, no performance, no audience, no noise to hide behind, just me and the accumulated weight of everything I never allowed myself to feel fully. And for the first time, instead of pushing the discomfort away, instead of numbing it or rationalizing it, a different question emerged. Not how to get rid of the pain, not how to fix it, not how to escape it, but what it was trying to show me. That question changed everything, because pain is not random. It is not meaningless. It is not a mistake. Psychologically, pain exists for the same reason. Physical pain exists. It is a signal, a message, a boundary, a form of intelligence. Touching fire teaches the body where not to linger. Emotional pain teaches the mind where something mattered, where something was violated, where something was lost or ignored. But the world doesn't teach how to listen to emotional pain. It teaches how to suppress it. From an early age, the message is clear. Don't cry, be strong, move on. Others have it worse. Slowly, quietly, a dangerous belief forms that pain is an inconvenience. Once that belief takes root, something internal fractures. Feelings become suspect. Reactions feel embarrassing. Needs feel excessive. Strength becomes synonymous with silence. But silence is not strength. Silence is where pain grows roots. The parts of me that hurt the most turned out to be the parts holding the most information. Pain pointed directly to what mattered, to what was loved, to what was hoped for, to what once felt meaningful. Nothing hurts deeply without meaning behind it. Grief does not attach itself to irrelevance. Loss does not form around indifference. Pain is evidence of investment. And yet, I treated it like an enemy. I believed that acknowledging pain would make it stronger, that opening the door would invite chaos, that once confronted, it would consume everything else. The opposite happened. When I stopped running, clarity replaced fear. Patterns emerged. Certain words cut deeper than others. Certain failures felt catastrophic. Approval carried more weight than it should have. Pain, once faced, began explaining my life back to me. The mind does not repeat pain to punish it, repeats it to be understood. The same emotional lessons appear again and again, disguised as new situations, different people, different environments, same internal response, until attention is paid. Listening does not mean drowning in sadness. It means witnessing experience honestly, without minimizing it, without dramatizing it, without rejecting it. It means acknowledging what happened mattered, but it left an imprint, that it changed something internally. Denying pain doesn't create strength, it creates division. One part of me kept moving forward. Another part remained frozen at the moment of impact, and no life becomes powerful while parts of the self remain abandoned. This is where real strength begins, not in pretending nothing hurt, but in having the courage to look inward without flinching. Most people never do this work. They spend their lives reacting instead of choosing, defending instead of creating, protecting wounds instead of transforming them, not because they are weak, but because this work is uncomfortable. Because facing pain feels like stepping into darkness without certainty. But pain itself is not the darkness. Avoidance is. When pain is faced, it changes form. It becomes insight. It becomes depth. It becomes empathy. It becomes empathy. It becomes direction. Every strong person I've ever admired, whether they speak about it or not, has sat with discomfort long enough to learn from it. Pain shaped them, but it didn't harden them. And that is where the shift begins. When the question changes, not why something happened, but what it is shaping. Meaning does not erase the past, but it redeems it. And meaning is the first step in turning pain into strength. For a long time, I believed pain was something that happened to me, an event, a memory, a chapter that ended. What I didn't understand was that pain doesn't stay in the past. It doesn't remain where it first occurred. It moves forward, quietly, invisibly. It integrates itself into identity, without asking for permission. Pain doesn't just hurt, it teaches. And when it's not understood, it teaches the wrong lessons. I began to see that the moments which wounded me didn't disappear after they passed. They continued living inside me as assumptions, as expectations, as silent rules about how the world works, and what I should be prepared for. I didn't consciously choose these rules. They formed automatically. If something hurt once, I learned to avoid it. If someone left, I learned not to depend too deeply. If I felt exposed, I learned to protect myself through distance or control. Over time, those strategies stopped being responses. They became traits. What started as protection slowly turned into personality. I told myself I was independent, when in truth I was guarded. I told myself I was low maintenance, when in truth I had learned not to ask. I told myself I didn't care much, when in truth I cared deeply and didn't feel safe showing it. Pain has a way of disguising survival strategies as identity, and because those strategies once worked, because they reduced discomfort, prevented further injury, helped me cope, they felt justified, necessary, even intelligent. But survival is not the same as growth. I began to notice how automatic my reactions were, how predictable, how rehearsed. Certain situations triggered responses before I had time to think. My body responded before my mind could intervene, tension before conflict, withdrawal before vulnerability, overthinking before rest. It felt less like choice and more like reflex. That's when a difficult realization surfaced. Parts of my life were being run by old pain, not present intention. I wasn't responding to what was happening now. I was reacting to what had already happened before. And those reactions had a structure. Pain builds defenses. Defenses are not signs of weakness. They are signs of intelligence under pressure. They form to protect what was once hurt. They create distance from danger. They reduce exposure, but they also limit range. The same wall that blocks harm also blocks connection. The same wall that blocks harm, and wanes injury also prevents intimacy. I didn't notice the cost at first. Defenses feel safe, familiar, predictable, but over time, they shrink life. Opportunities feel threatening instead of exciting. Closeness feels risky instead of nourishing. Change feels destabilizing instead of expansive. Pain had taught me how to survive, but not how to live freely. I began tracing my reactions backward. Why did certain criticisms linger longer than others? Why did rejection feel like confirmation rather than information? Why did mistakes feel like identity flaws instead of experiences? The answers always led back to earlier moments when something vulnerable was exposed and met with disappointment, absence, or dismissal. Those moments taught my nervous system what to expect, not consciously, automatically. And once expectations are formed, perception follows. I didn't see the world as it was, I saw it as it once hurt me. This is how pain shapes identity, not through memory alone, but through anticipation. I anticipated rejection, so I limited expression. I anticipated loss, so I withheld attachment. I anticipated judgment, so I filtered authenticity. Over time, these anticipations hardened into beliefs. Beliefs about what was safe, beliefs about what was possible, beliefs about what I deserved, and beliefs, once internalized, behave like facts. I didn't question them. I organized my life around them. I chose comfort over growth and called it wisdom. I chose predictability over risk and called it maturity. I chose control over openness and called it self-respect. But beneath those choices was fear quiet, rationalized, unnamed fear. Pain had not just shaped my past, it was quietly shaping my future. Another realization followed, one that was harder to accept. Pain doesn't only influence what is avoided, it influences what is pursued. Sometimes wounds don't create retreat, they create ambition. I noticed how certain goals carried emotional urgency far beyond their practical value. How some achievements felt less like desires and more like necessities. They weren't about fulfillment, they were about compensation, proving worth, regaining control, correcting old narratives. Pain doesn't always make a person small. Sometimes it makes them relentless. But relentless doesn't always mean free. I began to see how parts of my drive were fueled by unresolved hurt. How success sometimes functioned as a defense evidence against old wounds. And the problem with that kind of motivation is that it never rests. Because pain-driven ambition doesn't aim for satisfaction, it aims for relief. And relief is temporary. The moment an achievement loses its emotional charge, the hunger returns. Another goal appears, another standard rises, another internal demand forms. Not because growth is bad, but because pain was still speaking. At this point, a deeper question emerged. Who would I be without these defenses? Without these reactions? Without these inherited beliefs? That question was unsettling. Because when pain shapes identity long enough, it becomes familiar, even comforting. Removing it feels like losing structure. The defenses may be limiting, but they are known. Letting go of them feels like stepping into uncertainty without armor. And yet, something inside me knew this. The same pain that once protected me was now confining me. The wound had done its job. The lesson had been learned. But the behavior remained. That's when it became clear healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about updating the system it created. Understanding that what once kept me safe might now be keeping me small. And that realization marked the beginning of a different kind of work. Not fixing, not forcing, but understanding. Because pain doesn't loosen its grip through resistance, it loosens through awareness. At some point, without realizing it, I became divided. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that was obvious or visible. It happened slowly, through adaptation. There was the part of me that learned how to function, and there was the part of me that learned how to feel. And over time, those two parts stopped speaking to each other. The functional part took over. It learned how to navigate the world efficiently, how to stay composed, how to respond instead of react, how to meet expectations, how to survive emotionally charged environments without falling apart. That part became skilled. It learned timing, tone, restraint. It knew when to speak and when to stay silent, when to engage and when to withdraw. It learned which emotions were acceptable and which ones needed to be hidden or softened. This part helped me succeed. But there was another part, quieter, less organized, less articulate, that held everything I didn't know how to process at the time. That part carried disappointment without language, grief without ceremony, anger without permission. It didn't disappear, it waited. I didn't intentionally abandon it. I just didn't know how to include it in the life I was building. So I learned to live from the surface, from the mind, from the role, from the identity that worked. And slowly, subtly, I began to identify more with the version of myself that was acceptable than the version that was authentic. That's how the split happened. The adapted self became who I was. The emotional self became who I used to be. And because the adapted self functioned well, it felt responsible, mature, strong. The emotional self, on the other hand, felt inconvenient, excessive, risky. So I learned to keep it contained. But containment is not integration. What I didn't realize at the time was that this internal split came with a cost, energy. Holding parts of myself away from awareness required constant effort. Emotional regulation turned into emotional suppression. Control became the default state. I was calm but not relaxed, stable but not grounded, capable but not fully present. There was always a subtle tension running underneath everything, like background noise that never turned off. The adapted self had armor, not visible armor, psychological armor. It showed up as rationality when emotions surfaced, as humor when vulnerability approached, as distance when intimacy deepened. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't coldness, it was protection. The armor formed because something once hurt deeply enough that openness felt dangerous afterward. And armor is intelligent. It learns exactly where to harden. If expression led to rejection, expression was filtered. If dependence led to disappointment, independence became exaggerated. If honesty led to shame, silence became safety. Over time, these adjustments felt normal, natural, even virtuous. I told myself I was self-sufficient. I told myself I didn't need much. I told myself I preferred solitude. And some of that was true. But some of it was adaptation disguised as preference. The problem with armor is not that it exists. The problem is that it doesn't know when to come off. It protects in situations that no longer require protection. So moments that called for openness met restraint. Moments that invited connection met analysis. Moments that offered rest met vigilance. I didn't feel unsafe, but I didn't feel fully alive either. The emotional self, the part that carried the original pain, didn't stop trying to be heard. It expressed itself indirectly, through restlessness, through irritability that didn't match circumstances, through fatigue that sleep didn't fix. Sometimes through sadness without a clear reason. Sometimes through a sadness without a clear reason. Sometimes through a sense of emptiness even when life looked full. The adapted self tried to manage these signals. It labeled them as mood, as stress, as temporary imbalance. But the signals kept returning, because the emotional self wasn't asking to be fixed. It was asking to be included. Another realization followed, one that shifted how I understood my inner life. The pain I avoided didn't stay frozen in time. It matured. It evolved alongside me. It changed shape. What began as hurt transformed into guardedness. What began as fear transformed into control. What began as loss transformed into detachment. Pain didn't remain raw. It became organized. And organization made it harder to recognize. The armor didn't feel like fear. It felt like wisdom. The distance didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like boundaries. The restraint didn't feel like suppression. It felt like discipline. And that's what made it so convincing. But something inside me noticed the pattern. The more I armored myself, the less I felt moved by life. The less surprised I was. The less touched. The less affected. Life became manageable but muted. I could handle things, but I rarely felt met by them. And the question that began forming underneath everything was quiet but persistent. What am I protecting myself from now? That question didn't accuse. It observed. Because at some point, protection stops being necessary and starts being habitual. And habits don't ask whether they still serve the present. They repeat what once worked. The emotional self had been left behind not because it was weak, but because it didn't fit the conditions of survival at the time. But time had passed. The environment had changed. The threat was no longer the same, yet the internal structure remained. And that's when another layer of truth emerged. The adapted self was not the enemy. The emotional self was not the problem. The issue was separation. Wholeness requires dialogue, and dialogue requires listening. But listening to buried parts is uncomfortable. They speak in sensations, not sentences. In feelings, not arguments. They don't justify themselves logically. They don't follow productivity timelines. They simply exist and want acknowledgement. The armor resisted that. Because armor's job is to prevent vulnerability, not facilitate it. So every time I slowed down enough to feel something unfamiliar, the system tightened. Distraction increased. Control returned. Structure reasserted itself. And yet, something had shifted. Awareness. Once the split was seen, it couldn't be unseen. I could feel the difference between acting from adaptation and acting from alignment. Between responding from protection and responding from presence. And that awareness created discomfort, but also possibility, because discomfort meant sensitivity was returning, and sensitivity, when no longer overwhelming, is not weakness, it's information. As awareness grew, something subtle but unsettling happened. I began noticing myself in real time, not judging, not correcting, just observing. Moments that once felt natural now revealed their mechanics. How quickly I redirected conversations away from emotion, how easily I intellectualized experiences that asked to be felt, how instinctively I downplayed my own needs before anyone else had the chance to. These reactions weren't dramatic. They were smooth, efficient, almost elegant. That's what made them hard to question. They didn't feel like fear, they felt like composure. But composure can be a refuge or a hiding place. The adapted self had learned an important lesson early on. Staying regulated keeps things from falling apart. And for a long time, that lesson was true. Regulation prevented overwhelm. Control prevented chaos. Distance prevented disappointment. But regulation slowly became restriction. The emotional range narrowed. Highs softened. Lows were managed. Everything moved toward the middle. Stability replaced intensity. Predictability replaced depth. And while nothing felt overtly wrong, something essential was missing. The emotional self, the part that had been set aside, didn't disappear. It simply lost direct access to expression. So it found other routes. It appeared as longing without a clear object, as nostalgia for moments that couldn't be explained, as a sense of incompleteness even during success. Sometimes it showed up as emotional hunger, not hunger for people specifically, but for resonance, for being understood without translation, for being met without performance, for existing without adjustment. But because the adapted self was in control, that hunger was often misread. I mistook it for restlessness, for boredom, for dissatisfaction with circumstances. So I tried to solve it externally, change environments, set new goals, improve routines. But the feeling followed, because it wasn't about where I was, it was about what part of me was allowed to be present there. I began to notice something else, something more uncomfortable. The armor didn't just block pain, it filtered connection. Even in moments of closeness, something stayed guarded. A layer remained intact. I could be present without being exposed, engaged without being fully revealed. It wasn't dishonesty, it was modulation, sharing but not too much, opening but not all the way, letting someone see me but only the parts that were already safe. And because this pattern had been refined over years, it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like discernment, but discernment doesn't require self-erasure. I began to sense the difference. True boundaries create space for authenticity. Armor creates distance from it. One allows movement, the other enforces rigidity. The emotional self felt that rigidity. It felt like being held back at the edge of expression, like wanting to step forward but being restrained by an invisible hand. And with that restraint came a quiet grief. Not grief for a specific loss, but grief for parts of myself that hadn't been lived fully. Words unsaid, needs unmet, truths delayed. That grief didn't ask for correction. It asked for recognition. But recognition meant allowing discomfort, because acknowledging the emotional self meant admitting that strength alone hadn't been enough. That control hadn't solved everything. That adaptation had a cost, and that was difficult to accept. The adapted self had worked hard. It had kept things together. It had prevented collapse. Letting go of its dominance felt like betrayal. But integration doesn't mean rejection. It means balance. I started to understand that the goal wasn't to dismantle the adapted self, but to soften its grip. To let it step back when protection was no longer required. To allow the emotional self to re-enter without overwhelming the system. That process wasn't linear. At times, emotions surfaced abruptly raw, unfiltered, intense, not because they were new, but because they had been stored for so long, Old sadness appeared without context. Old anger surfaced without direction. Old fear emerged without immediate cause. The adapted self panicked at first. It tried to suppress again, to regain control, to reassert order. But something was different now. I didn't interpret these emotions as threats. I saw them as delayed messages, not problems to solve, but experiences to witness. This required patience, because the emotional self didn't speak clearly at first. It didn't explain itself. It didn't justify its presence. It simply arrived and waited. Learning to stay with that discomfort without fixing it was unfamiliar. There was no productivity in it, no visible progress, no immediate payoff, just presence. And presence felt exposed. But exposure, I began to realize, wasn't danger. It was sensation. The body reacting honestly, the mind loosening its grip. For the first time in a long while, I felt moved again. Not destabilized, but touched. Moments carried weight. Music lingered longer. Silence felt fuller. Not overwhelming, alive. The adapted self noticed this too. It didn't disappear, but it relaxed. Control softened into awareness. Regulation shifted into responsiveness. The emotional self didn't need to take over, it needed to be allowed. And as that allowance grew, something surprising happened. The need for armor decreased. Not because the world became safer, but because I became more present within it. Presence doesn't eliminate pain. It contextualizes it. Pain becomes an experience, not a threat to identity. And identity becomes flexible, not reactive. This was not a transformation, it was a reintroduction, a remembering of who I was before everything had to be managed, before expression had to be filtered, before strength meant silence. The adapted self had carried me through difficult terrain, but the emotional self was the part that could teach me how to feel grounded in new ground, and both were necessary. Integration wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about letting them speak to each other again. For a long time, pain felt like something that interrupted life, something that delayed progress, something that needed to be overcome quickly, something that, if held onto too long, meant weakness. So I learned how to function around it. I learned how to keep moving, how to adapt, how to become someone who could survive disappointment, rejection, and silence without showing cracks. And that adaptation worked. It kept things together. It allowed life to continue. It created stability where chaos once existed. But what I didn't understand then was this. Pain doesn't stop shaping a life just because it's hidden. What is not felt does not vanish. What is not felt does not dissolve. It reorganizes itself inside. Slowly, quietly, pain becomes structure. It becomes beliefs about what is safe, expectations about what will happen, limits around how deeply life can be experienced. Without realizing it, I wasn't just avoiding pain. I was organizing my identity around it. The person I became was not accidental. Every emotional defense had a history. Every reaction had a reason. Every fear had an origin. Pain taught me how to survive, but survival slowly replaced aliveness. And that's the cost no one warns about. When pain is avoided long enough, it stops hurting loudly and starts shaping quietly. It decides how close I allow people to come, how much truth I allow myself to express, how much risk I allow myself to take. Not because I wanted it to, but because the mind repeats what once protected it. At some point I realized something that changed everything. The parts of me I was most ashamed of, the guardedness, the control, the emotional distance, were not flaws. They were adaptations. They were intelligent responses to moments when something vulnerable met something unsafe. And once that became clear, the inner conflict softened. There was no enemy inside me, no broken part, no weakness to erase, only parts that had been doing their job for too long. Healing then was not about becoming someone new. It was about becoming whole, about allowing the adapted self and the emotional self to exist in the same space. about letting strength and sensitivity speak to each other instead of competing. Pain, when understood, stopped feeling like a threat. It became information. It explained why certain patterns repeated, why certain relationships felt familiar, why certain fears appeared even when circumstances had changed. Pain revealed the map of my inner world, and once that map became visible, choice returned. Not instant freedom, not constant peace, but awareness. And awareness is the beginning of strength, because strength is not the absence of pain. Strength is the ability to remain present while pain speaks without being consumed by it or ruled by it. Real strength is integration. It's the ability to say, this happened, this mattered, this shaped me, and it does not get to define my limits anymore. There's a simple, real-life example that captures this more clearly than any concept. I once avoided certain conversations, honest ones. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because honesty once led to loss. So silence felt safer. For years, that silence looked like maturity, like control, like emotional intelligence. But it also meant relationships stayed shallow in places where depth was possible. One day, in a moment that wasn't dramatic, I chose differently. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. I spoke something that felt exposed, vulnerable, slightly uncomfortable. Nothing collapsed, no catastrophe followed. What followed instead was something unfamiliar, relief, not because the outcome was perfect, but because I was no longer divided inside. That moment didn't erase the past, but it proved something important. Pain had taught me to protect myself, but I was no longer living in the moment that required that level of protection. And that's how pain becomes strength, not by disappearing, not by being denied, but by being understood, integrated, and updated. Pain shows where something meaningful once existed, where values were formed, where identity was shaped. When listened to, pain refines perception. It deepens empathy. It grounds ambition. It clarifies purpose. It transforms from a wound into wisdom. And this is the quiet truth beneath everything. The life I am capable of living expands in direct proportion to the pain I am willing to understand. Not relive, not dramatize, not romanticize, understand. Because once pain is understood, it no longer controls direction. It becomes a foundation, and from that foundation, strength grows, not loud, not performative, not rigid, but steady, grounded, real. That is how pain stops being something that happened to me and becomes something that shaped me without imprisoning me. Pain didn't break me. It taught me how to survive. But survival was never the goal. The moment I stopped running from what hurt, I stopped being controlled by it. What once felt like a wound became clarity. What once felt like weakness became depth. Pain doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It transforms when it's understood. And that's how pain stops owning a life and starts building one. What hurt me didn't ruin my life. It revealed the strength I hadn't met yet.